G20 members meet in Doha to discuss their commitment to the developing world, but the major players are absent. So can the poorer nations really take hope from a conference that the richest won't attend, rearranging the world's wealth or wasting their time? This is Inside Story. Hello there, I'm Kamal Santamaria. With a global financial crisis crippling the biggest banks, the biggest stock markets, the biggest industries all over the world, it would be easy to overlook the developing world and its uneasy future. So enter the Doha Conference, as it's become colloquially known, a UN forum here in the Qatari capital, focusing on aid and cooperation for development. Problem is, the most important heads of state, as well as those of the IMF and the World Bank, didn't even show up, raising the question: is there anyone left willing to pay for the development in times of crisis, or is this conference just a big old waste of time? That's going to be the centre of our discussion today. But first, just a bit of background. This meeting in Doha is actually a follow-up to the conference on financing for development held in Mexico. That was back in 2002. At that conference, 50 countries adopted the so-called Monterrey Consensus, which has become a major reference point for international development cooperation. Have a look at some of these points which came out of it. First of all participating countries agreed to mobilise financial resources for development. It was decided international trade was the key to this, and direct foreign investments were to be fostered. Secondly, they agreed to increase financial and technical cooperation between developed and less developed nations. The issue of external debt of many southern countries was supposed to be revisited. And thirdly, there was a consensus that addressing the symptoms was not enough. In order to foster development, the very structure of the international monetary and trading system would need to be addressed first. And so we find ourselves here, Doha 2008. This current conference reviews whether or not progress has actually been made on all of those points. But contrary to the Monterrey meeting, hardly any heads of state from the important industrialised nations have turned up. For the host country, though, Qatar, the summit is apparently an opportunity to clarify who should bear the brunt of the world development and why.
We get the impression sometimes that the whole burden of development is being thrown onto oil-producing countries. This is a logic in which developed countries renegade from their commitments. The developed countries do not have the right to dictate on others what they should do, giving them directions, guidance and advice, then exempting their countries from the required participation necessary for achieving development. Some of the participants should know that development is an umbrella of peace that protects everyone. In fact, it may prove more effective than piling up weapons.
Either to swim together or to die together. So it's a matter is you cannot, the world is a small village. They cannot work alone. Nobody can work alone. It is a collective effort, collective measurement to encounter this problem, to achieve a goal.
Well, joining our discussion today, I'm pleased to say, our guests who have all come to Doha. Stefano Mancusi is the Director General for Development of the European Commission. Hello. Brian Hook is the Assistant Secretary of State for International Organization Affairs from the United States. And Sylvia Boren, the co-chair of the Global Call to Action Against Poverty. Thank you, everyone, for joining us on Inside Story. I want to go back to the comments which we just heard there from the Emir of Qatar, and he said he gets the impression, at least, that the whole burden of development is being thrown on oil-producing countries. Sylvia Boren, let me come to you first and raise this idea. Why not? If not the whole burden, then couldn't a large amount of burden actually go to these countries, which do, let's face it, have a lot of money available?
Yes, but the fact is that many countries in the world, and certainly in the developed world, have a lot of money available. And we know that better this year than we have known it for a long time, because in my bookkeeping, more than $3 trillion have been found to bail out the financial systems, the banks. And the problem is that this kind of money is not being spent on developing countries, although the promises have been made time and time again. We've had the UN agreements in the 90s, we've had the Millennium Goals Declaration and the goals, we've had the Monterrey Agreement, and now we have the Doha Agreement. Just to give you some idea, just this last week, the European Commission, with a lot of difficulty and wrangling, managed to find €1 billion extra for the very serious food crisis that's happening at the moment. A few days later, it was announced that €260 billion was found for encouraging the European economies and encouraging consumption to make sure production could keep going, etc. Now, for me, it's not just a food or fuel or finance or climate crisis. It's a moral crisis, because if we're spending that much more on keeping the developed world consuming, and we're not prepared to keep, or we're prepared to keep so little of our promises to actually support developing countries, and particularly the vulnerable peoples in those countries. And it's, for me, a major gender crisis happening at the moment. The people who are hit worst are the women.
Let me just interrupt you, because you pick up on the point that you've mentioned a lot of euros there. Let's ask Stefano Mancusi about this. We all know about these huge bailouts which have happened all over the world. Do you feel, and I think a lot of people would understand that they needed to happen under this very acute crisis right now, but is that money, or is there money that's not going to, for example, the developing world that could be going there?
Well, I would say just referring to what has been said at the beginning, I would like to recall that the European Union is present here with the President of the Union, President Sarkozy, and the President of the Commission, President Barroso. I would like that others had done the same things, just to show the level of commitment. Second, we arrived here being, in spite of all, still as the biggest donor in the world, because the European Union alone is providing 60% of the ODA right now. And as you recalled, we arrived also with 1 billion more additional for food crisis. All this is certainly not enough, but I would say I would like that everybody could start doing and taking its own responsibility, because, as you said, the crisis is important. The money available is certainly not enough, but at least let's comply with our commitment. Once said that, and Europeans are trying doing it, I think that the key point is, as it has been said in the G20 in Washington, to keep our commitment and to add fresh money, additional money, and to build together a new architecture which will involve also the poorest country, which is not the case yet. So once said that, I think that we should look at this conference as a moment where we have to take a collective responsibility. I think that we have to do our part. I think that everybody should work alone. And I believe that indeed, we spend a lot of money. By the way, we are not alone in spending a lot of money in sustaining our economy. Our goal, our fight as European Commission is not to lose sight of the poorest, and to accompany this intervention on our economy also with an increase on development aid. It's not easy, but the evidence of the one additional billion is a good one, and I hope that others will follow.
Brian Hook, does the United States have the same theory that Stefano Mancusi was talking about there, about not neglecting the poor in the developing countries? Because, as you will, I'm sure, be aware, the United States came under a lot of flack for the whole $700 billion bailout deal.
Well, the $700 billion that you referenced was an injection of capital to ease some of the credit crunch that we were experiencing. And the whole objective of the President's rescue plan is to actually get us out of this financial crisis. And if we can improve a lot of the economies around the world, that is going to be to the benefit of the developing countries, because private financial resource flows is really the engine for economic growth in the developing world. You know, private financial resource flows dwarf official development assistance. And I think that we are trying to do everything we can to get past this international financial crisis. But I wouldn't call it a bailout. We certainly have a credit crunch. We have a liquidity crisis. And once we're able to stabilize banks, that's going to promote lending to small and medium business owners, and that's going to help get the economy back on its feet again.
Let me just get a quick reaction from Sylvia Boren there, because I did see you shaking your head there as Brian Hook was speaking.
No, you see, it's, we know, and it's very clear at this Doha conference, by now we know very well a lot of the facts and figures and the way to solve the situation in the world. It is not the same to say that the private money flows and the free trade is going to encourage the economies in the developing countries. What has to happen first is that there has to be a lot of investment in education, in health, in local agriculture, and that's why we're having a food crisis, in local enterprise, and from there a real economy has to build up in the developed countries, and that does not have to be ruined by forced free trade arrangements, etc. And what we're seeing now is that the banks and the financial crisis in the north, which is of no fault of the developing countries, is interfering with the real economies in the south, in the developing countries. We can predict that sometime down the line the Millennium Goals are going to slip backwards at the moment. The hunger is very real. You've got to realize that there are situations where food prices have doubled, and for families who spend 80% of their money on food, this means they have to choose which child to feed, and this is the stories we've been hearing literally in our poverty hearings of GCAP. You've got to realize there's a tremendous number of people in the world extremely upset about the situation. Last October, we had 116.9 million people in 131 countries standing up and taking concrete actions against poverty. Now, as far as I'm concerned, America here in Doha in the negotiations is blocking the negotiations, is really involved in a power struggle about whether the United Nations should take more control and make sure that there's financial regulations.
Okay,
America doesn't want that. So at the moment, America is not playing ball here, and we, as civil society, are very upset about that.
Okay, we'll come back to all those points in just a moment. We've got to take a quick break. But really, can there be a democratic approach to managing the world's finances? We'll look at that plenty more in just a moment.